Trifles by Daniel Bosch. The question is, prosecute Minnie's decision to kill her husband. What evidence in the play condemns her actions? What details suggest that Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters are wrong to help her go free? Minnie's decision to kill her husband was the wrong decision to make, in my opinion. At that time, I understand that it was very hard for somebody to get a divorce, but that does not give somebody the reason to take another person's life. On top of that, that does not give somebody else a reason to cover up the evidence to let that person go free. The bird in the story meant a great deal to Minnie or Mrs. Wright. The bird was a way for her to communicate or express herself to some other type of being. Supposedly from the story and the film, her husband, Mr. Wright, was a very cold and bitter man who didn't want kids. This caused her to go out and try to find a way of something to talk to, something to communicate, somebody just to share something of her daily life with. This bird was kind of her outlet. So when Mr. Wright wound up killing the bird, this angered her severely. That is why it was probably the main reason why the woman covered it up, because it would have been that way, that nail in the coffin, the conviction that they needed to convince the jury that she committed this crime. Like I said, the bird was one of the driving forces that the book and the movie used, and why Minnie was so angered, and was one of the reasons why she finally decided to kill her husband. A quote that I used from the story: "No, Wright wouldn't like the bird, a thing that sang. He didn't really like his wife expressing herself. He just wanted her to be bottled up, so to say, and, just not express her feelings to everybody else. So that bird kind of gave her that outlet, which he didn't want because he was a very controlling man on the farm." This was a reason that the people who supported her action, like in the critical articles, say that she was justified in killing him. They believed that Mr. Wright was a bitter man, didn't want any kids, she couldn't express herself, so the bird, like I said, was an outlet for her. At the time, she couldn't get a divorce, so this pet was a great thing for her to communicate with. But really, does that justify her killing somebody over a dead animal, a dead pet? I know it was a way for her to communicate, something to express her feelings to, that wasn't just a cold stone to say that Mr. Wright was. But even just one pet dying, I know it was a devastating feat to her, but that does not give her the reason to go and kill somebody. The article that I have chosen to write on was written by Lane A. Glenn. This is the quote: "The most shocking act is the deliberate cover-up of Mrs. Wright's act by two well-intentioned but ultimately criminal conspirators. The problem is that Miss Hale and Miss Peters were trying to do the right thing by covering up the crime, but what they didn't realize that they were doing is that they were interfering with a criminal investigation. So even though they thought it was the right thing and that Mrs. Wright was mistreated, ultimately they stopped a guilty person who killed somebody to get off scot-free on trial because the sheriff couldn't produce the evidence that they needed to convict her. The bird would have been one of the driving points in the argument that she had a reason or a motive behind doing what she did." Miss Hale from the start supported Mrs. Wright. She believed that she was justified in doing what she did, which was killing her husband. That what she really did was to cover up the evidence and hide it from the sheriff. That she was kind of the vigilante saving Mrs. Wright from an unworthy prosecution. This ultimately would lead to Mrs. Wright's conviction falling through the floor and letting her go free. So all in all, Mrs. Hale covered up the evidence from a guilty person who committed a very bad crime from the police. Some of the evidence that they covered up wasn't just the bird, but for another example, her sewing. If you remember in the story and the movie, her sewing was out of line, which could be showed that she was in some kind of distress that would have caused her to do it this way, which is another thing that the prosecutors could have used to turn it around. But still, covering up the evidence was a bad thing to do and was very uncalled for. This led to Mrs. Hale adjusting and rearranging the stitches so it didn't look like a mess. This was just another thing that they covered up to hide from the sheriff. Still, the bird would have been a clear motive that would have convicted her, but granted, both the women hid the evidence. In the minds of Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, they believed that this was a clear-cut case, and they saw the bird and the sewing as a way that they could have turned it to convict her. the sheriff would now have a motive for Minnie, which would have trapped her right in the case. But with the sheriff stumped because they didn't get the evidence, this let Minnie go free, or possibly go free in the future. So Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters now feel like heroes because of what they did, but honestly what they did is just let somebody who was committed of a crime, who had evidence behind them, let go free because of what they believed was morally correct, which in some cases is the right thing to do, but in others, like this situation, she should have been committed of a crime that she rightfully committed. Now we go into the other woman that helped cover up the evidence, Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Peters was the wife of the sheriff in the story. Throughout the story and movie, I feel she was more intimidated by her husband or just the role that she played in society more than Miss Hale. Mrs. Peters seemed to play more of a dominant role in society and throughout her community. Therefore, she seemed to be more inclined to play accordance to the gender roles of that time period. By this I mean she seemed to be more submissive to her husband, who was the sheriff in the situation. This caused her to second guess herself a couple times throughout the movie whether she was doing the right thing or not. This led me to believe that if it was not for Mrs. Hale trying to push Mrs. Peters to cover up the evidence, then Mrs. Peters would have just turned it over to her husband and Minnie would have got convicted because they would have had all the evidence that they would have needed. Nonetheless, Mrs. Hale, through her persuasion, convinced Mrs. Peters to cover it up even though she was second guessing herself throughout the story. The picture at the bottom of the page shows how male supremacy was over women at the time. The quote at the top of the page furthers my decision that Mrs. Peters believed that what they were doing was wrong. The quote says, "Of course, it's no more than their duty." Here she is saying that the sheriff and the Mrs. Hale's husband going through all of Minnie's stuff was no more than their duty, that this was just a daily thing they had to do to try and search the criminals to see if they could find the evidence. This was correct, and she should have stayed down this path rather than hiding the evidence so that they could convict Minnie. She second-guessed herself throughout the movie, which should have inclined her to think, hey, maybe I'm doing the wrong thing here, which she definitely was. Mrs. Peters should have either avoided the peer pressure from Miss Hale, which was constant throughout the whole entire movie hiding the evidence, or just went to another room entirely so she wouldn't have to look like a conspirator. A perfect example of this is the stitching in the quilt. Mrs. Peters kept on saying, "What are you doing? Don't do that," and Mrs. Hale kept on doing it and restitching the fabric. This led her to finally cover up that evidence from showing that Minnie might have been distressed with that quilt. Now maybe we go to what the story was really trying to portray, which was gender roles. This played a huge role in the way that the story was portrayed or the way that it ended up. During this time period, men were completely dominant over females. This is why Miss Hale, Miss Peters, has such an overwhelming urge to help Minnie. Even if it wasn't their place to help her, it was still, their role in society. They try to further themselves as women. This is a good quote. "Cast a long shadow of blame across society that would push these women to such an act of desperation." By this, it means that society was so messed up and that woman was so submissive to men during this time period, how they didn't have a say in anything, that it pushed them to such an act that would ultimately cover up evidence of convicting a guilty person. Now this goes back to showing how Miss Hale and Miss Peters were wrong in what they did. I believe that even if Minnie wasn't their friend, which is sort of the truth considering that they really didn't even know the woman for the last years of her life, that the woman felt that it was their battle between them and the men, that this was a way for them to show that, hey, I have a role, hey, I have something to prove to you. This furthers my decision in that it was wrong for the woman to help Minnie go free. Here's a good quote. "Ah, loyal to your sex, I see. But you and Miss Wright were neighbors, I suppose you were friends too." He is addressing this at Mrs. Hale. Even though they were neighbors throughout the whole entire lifespan that Minnie lived on the farm, they really never even talked to each other. This is due to Mr. Wright's behavior, but this also shows that Mrs. Hale was doing this out of spite of the gender roles to further herself rather than maybe helping Minnie just because she was a good friend, which throughout the story you could clearly see that she wasn't always there when Minnie might have needed her to be. It seemed that Miss Hale was not only doing this to help Minnie, but also to disobey her gender roles in society without anyone really knowing or expecting that the two women could have this much of an effect. Granted that they should be supported, but what they were doing was good, but covering up evidence was not a good way to go about it. All in all, I feel like the woman's decision to cover up the evidence was wrong because it was not done solely to help Minnie, but seemingly for their own personal desire to take a strike at the society, a strike at those gender roles to show, hey, we're not going to stand for this, but covering up evidence was the wrong place and the wrong time. The conclusion of the question is this: Minnie was wrong to go about and killing her husband, and the quilt, bird, and also the state of the house condemns her action. The quilt showed that maybe she was a little agitated or angry because all of her stitches were fine except for the last couple of days. The bird was that motive that would have pushed her to the edge to show that he finally crushed her final freedom or form of expressing herself. And the house shows that she kind of didn't care about what happened anymore. This shows that maybe she was taking a strike, saying that she's not going to go down the traditional roles. But all in all these decisions doesn't lead to taking somebody's life. On top of this, Mrs. Peters and Miss Hale were wrong to hide the evidence which would ultimately have convicted Minnie of the murder. Peer pressure played a good part in this when Miss Hale kept on pressuring Miss Peters to hide the evidence. Ultimately, what they did was wrong. Minnie should not have murdered her husband, and Miss Peters and Miss Hale was wrong in covering up the evidence. My Works Cited page can be found on the next couple slides.